Good Yontif. This summer marked the 70th anniversary of the reinterment of Theodor Herzl in the State of Israel. Herzl, the founder of political Zionism, died in 1904 at the age of 44. Though he died in Vienna, in his last will and testament, Herzl made clear his wish to be buried in the Jewish homeland, a dream to most, but in Herzl's mind, a foregone conclusion. When the State of Israel was founded in 1948, Israel's first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, saw to it that the physical remains of its founding ideologue, Herzl, would be brought home. Ben-Gurion's words that August day of 49 framed the import of that moment for Israelis, for us today as well at this moment of Yizkor. Only two people, noted Ben-Gurion, have had the privilege of having their remains brought to Israel by their liberated nation: Joseph from Egypt and Herzl from Vienna. Ben-Gurion understood that this was a moment not just about physical retrieval, but spiritual as well, of honoring one's past, creating a collective conscience, meditating on how the values of our forebears inform our own lives. Just as Joseph commanded his kin, just as Herzl instructed his descendants, today here in this room we fulfill this mitzvah, the obligation of retrieving the memories of those individuals without whom we would not be here, as individuals and as a community. Today I want to share with you an aspect of the story you may not know about. Not about Herzl's final resting place, but about the cloth, the funeral pall, in Hebrew, the Parochet, that covered Herzl's casket on that August day of 1949. For a combination of reasons, World War I, the undeveloped state of pre-state Palestine, amongst others, in the decades following Herzl's passing, there was no way anyone could act on Herzl's request to be buried in the Jewish homeland. In 1935, the Zionist movement saw a window of opportunity, and at the 19th Zionist Congress in Lucerne, Switzerland, they agreed to move Herzl's remains to then British-controlled Palestine. A Viennese artist, Arthur Weiss, was commissioned to design the Parochet, the cloth, to cover the casket for the occasion. It was a gorgeous achievement, 2 meters long, 1.5 wide, 2 biblical verses, and the final passage of Herzl's famous book, Der Judenstaat, embroidered onto it. Had a blue and white motif, gold stitching, the image of a lion inside a Star of David, with 7 gold stars, reminiscent of Herzl's original proposal for the flag of the imagined Jewish state. The window of opportunity, however, did not last. The situation of European Jewry grew more precarious. Priorities shifted, and the plans to reinter Herzl were postponed indefinitely. In 1939, Arthur Weiss's Parochet did make it to mandatory Palestine to be stored in the JNF building, the Jewish National Fund building in Tel Aviv. Weiss, however, did not make it. He was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. His wife and children survived the war, hidden in France, saved by way of the deeds of righteous Gentiles. One can only imagine the emotions that August day in 49 when Herzl was reinterred in Jerusalem. If you will it, it is no dream. The wishes of Herzl's last will and testament fulfilled by way of burial in the sovereign state of Israel. Curiously, at the conclusion of the ceremony, the Parochet, which was meant to go on display in the Herzl room at the JNF building, was lost. In the coming decades, though goodwill efforts were made and conspiracy theories abounded, the Parochet, alas, was never to be found. And that's where things pretty much stood over the years. Arthur's son, Yitzchak, was only 3 when he was separated from his father. He grew up in France. He trained as an endodontist. he met his wife Isabel, and they made Aliyah to Israel in the early 1970s, going on to raise their 3 children and now 12 grandchildren. Yitzchak has no recollection of his father, only memories reconstructed by way of his mother. He knew that his father was an artist. There are Haggadot and wood cuttings by his name, but the connection to Herzl, never. His mother once made mention of something, but he dismissed it. The Parochet in his mind was created in 1949 in Israel for the reinternment service. His father, Arthur, had been murdered years before in 1942. And that's pretty much where things stood until one day in 1998, when, as Israelis are wont to do, Yitzchak and Isabel took a vacation in Kibbutz Hagoshrim in the Upper Galilee. Isabel decided to take a dip in the pool, and Yitzchak, laying in the sun on his chaise lounge, woke up from his shluf to pick up the book that Isabel had been reading. The book was Alt Neuland, Herzl's utopian fictional romance. Yitzchak read it cover to cover, and to Isabel's astonishment, read it over and over again. Something about the book prompted Yitzchak to reconsider the story of Herzl that he and all Jewish kids had been taught growing up. His intrigue became an obsession, and over the next 7 years, he spent every moment not in the clinic, deep in the Zionist archives, writing a new assessment of Herzl's legacy and relevancy for today. Published in 2005 in French, it was just translated into English. Theodor Herzl, a new reading, available on Kindle for a modest $7, dedicated appropriately to his now late wife, Isabel. In all those years, Yitzchak had no idea of the connection between his late father Herzl and his father and his late father and Herzl. The thought never crossed his mind, which is where things stood until December 14, 2005, a day that Yitzchak shares as one of the most important days of his life. Having spent years in the Zionist archives reaching Herzl, having submitted his book for publication, one morning Yitzchak found himself with a few spare minutes before his day at the clinic began. Yitzchak wandered into a Jerusalem bookstore where, behind the glass, the front page of Haaretz of August 17, 1949 was on display, a picture of the reinternment ceremony with Herzl's casket center stage draped in the Parochet. What caught Yitzchak's attention was not the picture, the iconic image that every Israeli has seen a million times. What stopped him in his tracks was a journalistic footnote that the Parochet had been made not in Israel in 49, but in Vienna in 36. Yitzchak's mother had long since passed, but he remembered her offhand comment, and he dove back into the Zionist archives to examine all the files pertaining to Herzl's reinternment, and it was there that he discovered that it was his father, Arthur Wise, who had, together with Oscar Strand, designed that Parochet. Just imagine how Yitzchak felt at that moment of discovery. Not just that his father, murdered in Auschwitz, was, as it were, a posthumous participant in the Zionist narrative, but that Yitzchak had spent 7 years researching the very topic that connected him to the father he never knew. Yitzchak got involved in the anniversary proceedings, and a replica of the lost Parochet was made. One can only imagine how Yitzchak felt this past summer when a replica of his father's original Parochet was publicly presented at the ceremony at Mount Herzl with Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Rivlin present. An expression of Kibud Av, of honoring one's father. In the words of the son, a reminder to all that one of those 6 million murdered in the Holocaust was a Jew named Arthur Wise. And that is pretty much where things stood until the day after the ceremony itself. Because some time ago, it was decided that the J&F warehouse building in Tel Aviv would be sold and turned into a boutique hotel, which meant that this summer would be the summer that everything had to be cleared out of the building. And you'll never guess what they found on the day after the 70th anniversary ceremony. There it was, a little gray, folded up, and under a cupboard, untouched for 70 years, the missing Parochet of Arthur Wise. And it was at that point that I decided to stop imagining and start asking. And so I called Dr. Yitzchak Wise, now 81, still a practicing endodontist. Dr. Wise shared with me the indescribable feeling to see his father's original handiwork, to touch the cloth itself that his father had touched, brushing it against his cheek. In his words, to feel the fingerprints of his father, the man he never knew, as close to him at that moment as he had ever been in life and in death. In case you're wondering, I did ask Dr. Wise about the plans for the Parochet. It's sitting right now in the town of Modi'in. Apparently, the JNF and the World Zionist Organization are in the midst of a legal battle over who it belongs to. The story, it would seem, continues. Friends, ours is a moment of Yizkor. Now is the time to enter the cupboards, the warehouses of memory. Some of the loved ones we recall were intimates, people with whom we journeyed through the chapters of life, brothers and sisters, spouses, children, parents, and friends. Some we knew only from a distance, the stories of their lives relayed to us by way of others. The project of Yizkor, of memory, is nevertheless, for all of us, one and the same. We hold those memories close as a cloth brushing against our cheek, and we look to connect. We ask how the lives of our loved ones inform our own. What were their values? What were their triumphs? What were their setbacks? How can we learn from them? How can we honor them in our own lives? How shall we fulfill the unfinished legacies they bequeath to us? We have all been diminished by their passing, and our loss can overwhelm. But the memories, they can still teach. A final thought, a final image, one last loose end. Aside from the passage from Herzl's book, what were those two biblical verses that Wise chose to embroider on the Parochet in 1936? The first, from the book of Ezekiel, speaks to Wise's commission. Behold, I will open for you your graves and cause you to come out of your graves, O my people, and bring you to the land of Israel. The second, more familiar to us, from the book of Psalms, those who sow in tears shall reap in joy. Always, but especially at this Yizkor hour, we know that the tears of sorrow flow freely. But as Yitzchak Wise came to discover, from those tears of sorrow can come comfort, redemption, and sometimes even joy. May that be our blessing in this Yizkor hour, that the tears we shed today bring with them the gift of memory, the gift of comfort, and one day, in the unknown distant future, the promise of joy. Amen.